In the aftermath of Calais and the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk in late May and early June 1940, it was quickly realized that preparation for the invasion and reconquest of Europe would have to take account of fighting in built-up areas. These scenes come from an army training film made in a blitzed area of London's Dockland in 1941.
Avoid dodging from side to side of a street. It takes you into the open. If you have to cross a coverless street, do so by the shortest possible route at right angles. Do not move diagonally across an open street, which is a slow process, and while you're doing it, you're vulnerable. As far as possible, keep to one side of the street, dodging from cover to cover, and don't bunch. Often a doorway is only big enough to give cover to one or perhaps two men at a time. So don't play musical chairs with your cover. Keep well spread out. You can move just as fast and much more safely. But if you come to a stretch of street with no cover on your side of it, you should cross to the other side. Over! And then recross when you can get back into cover. But when you cross side roads, you must change your tactics. You can do it this way, if you choose. Or this way. Neither will get you far. Never take it one at a time. If the enemy snipers miss the first, they'll be ready for the next. Don't hang about in the middle of roads. If anyone falls, you can't afford to help him. In this case, it is better to bunch.
As well as demonstrating basic tactics at street level, the film illustrates a unique characteristic of urban fighting, the vertical dimension, whereby attacking and defending forces alike use the upper floors of adjoining buildings to move unseen and under cover. This vertical dimension of fibua assumed particular significance in the Allied attack on the Italian town of Ortona in December 1943. Ortona was valued by the Allies principally for its harbour to help resupply the 8th Army in its push northwards. It was decided, therefore, not to bomb the town in advance of the attack, thus avoiding the risk of damaging the port facilities. Another factor was the belief that the enemy would not make a stand here, but would continue to fall back under the weight of the Allied advance. In fact, the German plan was to halt this advance for the winter along the Gustav Line, of which Ortona was the eastern extremity. Defending the town were units of the 1st Parachute Division. They'd already acquired considerable street fighting experience in Sicily, and their defences within the town were prepared with extreme thoroughness. With a medieval castle, which was at that time substantially intact, as the focus of their defence, the German plan was to hold the northern part of the town and to funnel the Allied attack into the main square by means of demolitions blocking all routes through the town but the main one, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, which was left invitingly open. A battalion of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, part of the 2nd Brigade, 1st Canadian Division, was entrusted with the task of taking the town from the direction of the Orsonia-Ortona Road.
And eventually, on the 20th of December, under cover of a tremendous rolling barrage, I think it was called Morning Glory, our company was one of the ones which went into the assault onto the outskirts of Ortona. My platoon was a lead platoon, and we found that we could follow very closely behind the barrage, 75 to 100 yards. There was a railway embankment on our right which provided some cover for any shells that did happen to fall a bit short, and also served as a dividing line. And we were able to advance sufficiently rapidly that we were able to take possession of the German positions before the defenders really had a chance to become organized and to resist us. There were one or two sharp, intense firefights, which just slowed us down temporarily, but when the action was over, we were firmly entrenched on the outskirts of Ortona. We were just on the first line of scattered houses at that stage, and there was quite a large open space in front of us. It's hard to remember the exact depth of that. I would think it was 75 to 100 yards. And then the main built-up area, the highly centralized built-up area started at that time.
It was really just another Italian town, except for the great dome of the cathedral, which had been blown in half by the Germans as a roadblock. And this was visible on the skyline, particularly from the south.
Having reached the outskirts of the town, the Edmontons consolidated their positions in preparation for the attack on the town itself the next morning.
We started our attack into town, my company, which was D Company of the Edmonton Regiment. And we didn't get very far. There was a considerable opposition from the Germans, and my company, which I presume I had about 95 men when I started, in 2 hours was decimated to about 30, just over 30.
Company commander, Captain Stone, decided to split the company into three units. He would command one unit, as well as the whole company, of course. The company sergeant major would command the other unit, and I would command the third.
Dugan and I charged across the open ground, and I'm sure the enemy were completely nonplussed by this almost suicidal move on our part, but they got out of their very well camouflaged trenches and hiked away, and my sergeant major was a first-class shot, had a field day shooting them, and that's how the thing went.
This outflanked quite a substantial number of Germans, and D Company took, if I remember correctly, about, perhaps 12, 15 prisoners, including a very arrogant German sergeant major, all of whom I escorted back to battalion headquarters.
Daring leadership by Captain Jim Stone and his young platoon commanders succeeded in forcing a foothold on the edge of the town's first main square.
There was a great deal of fighting around the square that day, and other companies were involved, of course, over on the other flank. And the advance was sustained up to the square, which was the stop point for the night.
While the Edmontons were engaged in their battle for the square, a company of the Seaforth Highlanders fought for possession of the church known as Santa Maria di Costantinopoli on the southern approaches to the town. This church was to become the Seaforth's headquarters, as they too were committed to the main battle in support of the hard-pressed Edmontons. Commanding the Seaforths was Major Sidney Thompson, who on the morning of the 22nd of December 1943 was promoted Lieutenant Colonel.
But the Edmontons came up against pretty heavy opposition, and so the brigadier decided to commit the Seaforths as well. So we crossed through them onto the north side of the town, and we divided it up. They fought on the south side, and we fought on the north side, with the main highway being the dividing line, the main highway through the town.
For the Edmontons, the way ahead lay across the town's first square and down that main highway, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, towards the shattered dome of the San Tommaso Cathedral. But to move anywhere in the open was to invite a murderous hail of machine gun fire from well-placed and well-concealed German positions.
But I've talked to my commanding officer. I've suggested to him that as the Germans use noise to great effect, diving Stukas and loading mini mortars, that perhaps we could try the same thing. And so as a squadron of tanks came up, and one troop with my company started through the town in low gear with sirens screaming and the main armament firing forward down the road onto the house on its side, and the other armament shooting sideways while we traveled under that fire and went forward. And I must say we made remarkable progress for about 100 yards. We got to the first square when, unfortunately, the lead tank stopped. And I rammed the tank with my rifle butt and made enough noise that I got the tank commander to put his head out. And I said, "Why have you stopped?" And he said, "Looks like mines on the road, and tanks are very vulnerable in town." I won't repeat my profanity at the time, but there were no more tank support. And I must say, the whole momentum of the attack died right then. Once the tank stopped, my infantry kept going and crossed a lateral rows and got into some buildings on the other side, but there was an anti-tank gun sitting in the first square, pointing at the main drag. It was a 57-millimeter anti-tank gun. And I took my Piat man across the road and said, "Fire a rocket through that windshield." And it was pretty windy, and he fired about 6 feet above the gun shield. And I got most annoyed at the world and him, and threw some smoke grenades down in the road, and took a 36 grenade and ran up to the gun shield and threw a 36 grenade on the other side. And so we had no more trouble with it. We got past it, and the anti-tank gun sat there as long as we were in Ortona.
While the Edmontons battled for a foothold in the town's main street, the Seaforths on their left flank were confronted by a bewildering maze of narrow alleyways and streets impassable to tanks, with virtually every street corner covered by enemy machine guns and snipers.
The streets were narrow. The buildings were 3 to 4 stories high. The Germans had mined every intersection. They'd mined the roads with anti-tank mines and anti-personnel mines. The S mines were in great profusion all over the place. If you know what S mines are, you step on them and they bounce up about belly height and then go off.
The first thing we discovered, of course, was we had to learn the whole thing on the job, and we discovered that control was probably the most difficult, far more difficult than fighting in the open. It was hard to keep in touch with the troops on your flanks because there's buildings between you. And we found that you couldn't fight in big numbers. You'd have to, we fought in numbers of 4 and 5. It was the best way to attack. And we also discovered that it was difficult to protect our rear. The enemy could get in behind us and also get into our flanks without too much trouble. That's one thing we learned. And another thing we learned, of course, was that the explosives were probably the best weapon we had, and the hand grenades. And of course, we probably didn't have as many hand grenades as we'd like to have, because we didn't anticipate using them so much. The streets were, of course, the killing grounds. And if you moved into a street, bango, everything would open up. It's interesting that to find out whether a street was covered by the enemy, you drop some smoke in it, and they'd think you're going to cross, and bango, they'd open up the shells up through. And quite often we'd do this to discover where the fire was coming from. So it's the smoke into the street, and up the other end you'd hear the tat-tat-tat-tat, and we'd have somebody watching there. Then we'd go after them up there.
The German paratroops defending Ortona were well equipped, especially with automatic and anti-tank weapons. They were skilled in the laying of mines, in the use of explosives for demolitions, and in the booby-trapping of buildings.
The mortars and artillery are not very effective for close support in street fighting. Now, they can deny approaches. You can shell roads that are ahead of you and do that kind of thing, but the buildings themselves that take away the effectiveness of mortars and artillery for a close support, where they'd be useful to the person who's fighting in the streets. What's needed is a handheld weapon that you can fire and do much the same, wreak the same kind of mess that artillery would. We had pits, but we had nothing that was had a heavy enough charge to really be useful for that purpose.
We had our own anti-tank guns from our battalion, plus the brigade and divisional anti-tank guns, the 17-pounders, were brought in to give direct fire support, not against tanks, but against enemy machine gun and sniper posts. The procedure was that we would try to move from doorway to doorway, certainly not in the middle of the street, but keeping under close cover, dispersed in single file, and the platoon commander was almost, if not at the front, very close to the front. He had to give that type of leadership in that close-in fighting.
I think one of the things that in Ortona where perhaps my presence was useful, that I demonstrated a certain lack of concern for the enemy's shots that were flying around. And it made people, everybody, started to wonder, well, what am I hanging back for when he'll go? And I think that is the point of why you need, it sounds a bit egotistical, let me say bold leaders when you're in towns.
Determined and skilled defenders though the German paratroopers undoubtedly were, at no stage in the battle did they attempt any concerted counterattack, relying instead on their ability to re-infiltrate Canadian-held positions by night.
I was dozing off and was awakened by a yell that they had just taken 2 Germans moving through carrying a machine gun, which they were going to set up in our rear. And had they done so, of course, it made it most uncomfortable for us. So the lesson that I learned right there was double sentry everything at night, to make sure that there is no infiltration.
The Edmontons had begun their assault on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele on December the 22nd. A Company on the right of the street, D Company on the left, with B Company covering their right flank in the troublesome area between the Corso and the esplanade overlooking the harbour. By the afternoon of the 23rd, A and D companies had fought their way to the town's main square, the Piazza Municipale. But here the enemy defence stiffened, and blocking any possibility of tanks supporting an advance on the next objective, the cathedral and Piazza San Tommaso, was a huge pile of rubble created by the Germans as a tank obstacle. It was mined, and it was booby-trapped.
On the 24th, I went forward with Captain Stone to have a look at this heap of rubble, and well, he devised a plan as to how we were going to proceed. And then I went back to get my people, and there was a group of almost a dozen of our men who were coming along the street, fairly close to the buildings, but unfortunately not close enough. And a mortar bomb came down right in the center of this group, and it caused tremendous casualties. I think that almost every one of them was either a fatal casualty or badly wounded.
Defense is pretty easy in a built-up area. I'd sooner defend than attack in a built-up area. As you know, you've heard of this where they would let you into a building and have it already mined and then blow it after you got in. And the Edmontons lost a whole platoon that way.
With movement in the streets so dangerous, with ever-mounting casualties and the momentum of the attack reduced almost to stalemate, the realization that movement was possible through the buildings themselves, despite the ever-present threat of booby traps, was a lesson the Canadians learned the hard way.
When one of our company commanders, one of Longhurst, used it and blew through a couple of houses doing it, I was most intrigued with this thing. It was quite new to me. And he had taken 2 or 3 sticks of plastic explosive, tied them on the end of a pole, put a long fuse on, lit it, and blew holes through the wall, and his men jumped in with Tommy guns, sprayed the room, tossed some grenades down the stairs and followed them down and cleared the bottom and took a house in consequence, and then repeated it. Of course, you know, it takes a while to set the thing up. You can't go through the whole city in short order. But he was extremely effective in what he did, and got fairly close to the cathedral in a couple of days in consequence of using it.
We used pits to blast the holes, or teller mines against the wall to make the hole to go through. They would blast a hole, and then a boy would probably jump through with a machine gun and Tommy gun and spray it. But usually the impact of the wall going down would clear anybody that was in that other room, so you get through that way. The object of it, of course, was, as I say, so they didn't have to go out on the street. They would try to work their way to the top of the building, go through to the next room, and then down. Of course, it's easier to drop your grenades down to the next room or let them roll down the stairs. Quite often they'd, in corridors, our Mills hand grenade was much better than the German stick because you could bowl it along, whereas the stick had to be thrown. And throwing it, you have to expose yourself more than bowling it.
Fighting on the Edmontons' left flank, the Seaforths had, through the use of mouse-holing, broken the stalemate by December the 23rd and advanced to a large piazza quickly named Dead Horse Square, from the rotting carcass which remained there throughout the fierce battle which ensued for possession of a school building.
I broke the platoon down into groups of 3 to 4 men. Usually, if I had an NCO, I'd put an NCO in charge of each group. But by this time, of course, we had some very experienced other ranks, privates. And if I remember rightly, most groups were in charge of a senior private. We took this schoolhouse, and I think it was a schoolhouse, part of adjacent to a church in any case, in Dead Horse Square, and I put one section of my platoon, 4 or 5 men at the time, into this one of the rooms of the buildings where they settled down for the night, but they were blown up during the night, and in the morning they all 5 of them were covered in God knows how much rubble.
The bold leadership shown by the Canadian troops at all levels in what proved to be some of the most intensive street fighting of the Second World War had enabled them by Christmas Day in 1943 to force their way into the center of the town. But the core of the enemy's defense, the cathedral and the castle beyond it, had still to be taken. With the battle for Ortona now in its 5th day, the Seaforth's objective became the Via Tripoli, while the Edmontons continued their fiercely opposed advance on the Piazza San Tommaso, literally house by house. The devastation of days of relentless street fighting had reduced the town almost beyond recognition. Few now doubted that the town should have been bombed prior to the attack. At daybreak, on December the 27th, Lieutenant Alan Johnson had positioned his scout patrol on D Company's front line on the edge of the Cathedral Square.
I was there with a small scout patrol, and I heard something strange. People yelling and cheering. And having had some experience at scouting, I had a pretty good idea what the situation was. So I advanced at first with considerable caution, but within half a block or thereabouts, I began to find civilians. I was certainly surprised to find them there, and I still don't know whether they were simple householders or refugees from our part of town or where they came from. But they announced jubilantly to me that Tedeschi had avantied during the night, and they were apparently quite surprised to find him gone at daylight. They cautioned me about booby traps. Oh, and another wry sidelight on the advantage of a well-organized defender in street fighting. One of the first people I met was an English-speaking Italian who said, "I don't know what took you so long. There weren't many Germans here."
I don't think that we were prepared. I don't think that anyone expected, indeed, that Ortona would be held the way it was. We didn't think that the town as such merited that importance, but of course one has to look at it from the point of view of the grand German strategy for the stabilizing of their winter line.
The worst aspect of fighting in built-up area is tension and nervousness, because you couldn't relax. You're so close to the enemy. You expect them to hit you at any moment.
I can't recall seeing more than a passing glimpse of the snipers and the machine gunners, but you knew they were there because they were behind their machine guns, behind their sniping rifles, and behind their grenades. But you were lucky if you caught a glimpse of anybody, or unlucky, whatever the case may be.
Street fighting is won by the men, and not by the weapons. And the men actually in contact with the enemy are mostly commanded by junior NCOs. And people have to be really well trained if you're going to be successful in street fighting. These junior NCOs, you take 5 or 6 men and go into danger places and have to keep up the momentum of whatever attack you're making.
The lessons learned from the 1941 fibua training film were validated by the Canadians in Ortona in 1943. The breakthrough achieved by venturing into the buildings and mouse-holing through the upper stories confirmed the significance of the vertical dimension as a major factor in urban warfare.